Every building has a story to tell, but in many cases, we don't have written records of when exactly a building was constructed or how it changed over time. But by examining a building closely, we can read the clues and open a window into the history of the building itself and the people who built it and used it over time. When we're trying to read a building, one of the clues is about when it was built is the style. Like most things, there are fashions in buildings and in architecture. Although you can't pinpoint the date of construction based on the style, looking at the style of a building can get you in the general range and help you understand its construction. For instance, let's take the Teague House, which is one of the buildings that houses the Alabama Historical Commission offices. The large columns on the front of this building may remind you of a Greek temple. And indeed, this house has characteristics of what's known as the Greek Revival style. It has a symmetrical facade. It has mostly rectangular frame around the door. It does have that semicircular fan light above the door on the first floor, which is kind of a throwback. But if you look at the second floor door, that is definitely Greek Revival. And of course, it has those prominent classical columns across the front. Now, the Greek Revival style was really popular, especially in the South, starting in about the 1820s, but then it declined in popularity after the Civil War. So when you look at this house, you would guess that it's a pre-Civil War house, and you'd be correct. But if you look closely at the eaves, there's a hint that this building was constructed towards the later end of the pre-Civil War period. Around 1840, the Italianate style was gaining in popularity. Now, this building has the columns and a lot of the other features of a Greek Revival house, but it doesn't have the really boxy cornice or plain and flat cornice that you would expect on a pure Greek Revival house. Instead, this one has these scrolled brackets, which are more associated with the Italianate style. And indeed, the documented construction date for this house is 1848. One word of caution is that in the early 1900s, say from about 1900 to the 1940s, a lot of the 18th and 19th century styles made a comeback in architectural styles that became known as Classical Revival, Neoclassical, or the Colonial Revival. The Governor's Mansion, shown here, also has columns like the Teague House does, and it also has brackets in the cornice like the Teague House, but it was constructed in 1907, not before the Civil War. One of the clues about the later construction date is that it's got those paired windows on the second floor. You don't see paired windows before the Civil War. Similarly, those windows don't have divided lights. They're just one pane over one pane. And that technology was not widely available before the Civil War. So there are several clues there that it is not, in fact, a pre-Civil War house. Of course, most people did not have the resources to build high-style residences like the Teague House or the Governor's Mansion. On more modest houses, there's still clues from the style of the building, but they're more subtle. So taking a look at these two here as an example, we're going to focus on the clues that are evident at the roofline. So taking this top one, on this one you can see some evidence of the influence of the Craftsman style, which was popular primarily in the early 20th century. For one thing, it has these overhanging eaves. The front, they extend beyond the wall of the house. Also, if you look in that top gable peak, there's a little bracket that's very plain, just a triangular bracket. That is typical of the Craftsman style. Another hallmark of the Craftsman style is that the rafters are exposed at the end. So instead of being boxed like some of the ones you saw in the earlier ones, you can see each individual rafter. So all of this tells you probably early 20th century. And indeed, this was a mill house constructed in a mill village in the early 20th century. If you take a look at the bottom one, its eaves do not overhang at the gable end. They're very, very close. And it's also got those triangular brackets underneath the front eave, but they've got those horizontal things. They're very modern looking. So this house is more consistent with post-World War II styles, something that's called minimal traditional. Another thing that we look at when trying to read a building is the technology and methods of construction. To illustrate this, I'm going to talk a little bit about brick. In some brick walls, you'll see a combination of stretcher bricks, which is the long end of the brick facing out, and header bricks, which is when you have the short end of the brick facing out. So on the top left, you can see one of the most common ways of arranging headers and stretchers with one row of headers and then anywhere from 5 to 7 rows of stretchers. On the right is sort of a fancier type of brick bond with headers and stretchers called Flemish bond. On the bottom left, you can see that actually used on an Alabama building. And what this tells you when you've got headers and stretchers is that this is a structural brick wall, because those headers, the brick is placed perpendicular. So it's anchoring the depth of the brick wall. And indeed, you can that picture on the left is from this house shown on the right, which was constructed for the Civil War, and it has solid brick walls. But in other cases, you will see brick walls that don't have any headers, and it's entirely stretchers. What this tells you is that that is probably not a structural brick wall. That's a brick veneer that's been placed either over a wood frame building or over a concrete block or structural tile building. So some other masonry underneath that maybe doesn't look quite so nice as brick. This difference in brick bond is one of the many clues you have on the house I showed you earlier that this rear addition, which has just stretcher bond, is later than the earlier building that has the headers in it. When reading a building gets really fun is when you can put together the clues from the windows, from the brick, and the historical information to understand how a building changed over time. So this is actually a church, and if you look at the brick bond, you can see it's just stretcher, so that tells you it was a veneer. And it turns out there's a cornerstone that tells you that this building was remodeled in 1916, and in fact, it was brick veneer put over a frame building. The windows are not something that you would see in 1916. Metal windows weren't widely available, and they weren't available in this kind of configuration. So you're already suspicious that this window is not 1916. And if you look closely at the brick, you can see there was an earlier window, and in fact it was bigger than this one. Because if you see those rows of bricks lined up vertically just a little bit above the window, that's the original top of the window opening. So sometime after 1916, probably in the second half of the 20th century, before 1965, because we know that from historic photos, the older windows were taken out and these new windows were put in. But since they were smaller, they had to fill in the brick above. If you want to learn more about how to read historic buildings, I recommend taking a look at some of the books listed here. They all have great information about historic architectural styles and about the technologies that were available at different periods of time. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and happy Preservation Month.